with United Ways of the Pacific Northwest, and I just want to thank you all for being here. This is a great turnout, and you've highlighted for me that the next time we do a staff and volunteer roundtable, we'll have to have breakout sessions. So I'll be thinking about how to do the logistics of that.
But Wenatchee will take care of it.
And actually, that's what I was just going to say. The next one of these will be, I think it's June 25th in Wenatchee, and we're working on the schedule and the agenda for that. And then we'll come back to Oregon a little later in the year for another one. So, but really quick, I just wanted to tell you the short about United Ways of the Pacific Northwest, and then we'll go ahead and get going with our presentations. United Ways of the Pacific Northwest is the trade association now for Washington, Oregon, and some of Idaho. So we have 39 United Ways that we represent, and the mission of our organization is to help all of you succeed. So we do that by providing training and technical assistance like this, and then through doing public policy. So we have lobbyists in Salem and Olympia working primarily on early learning funding, 2-on-1 funding, and looking at, in Washington especially, how we can reduce some of the predatory loan products that are out there in our community. So working really hard and just kind of excited to get to know all of you and move on with today. So I'm gonna stop with that, and let's go ahead and go around really fast and do your name and where you're from so we can get an idea. Oh, and what your role is. So if you're a board, volunteer, or staff, and what your role is at the staff level, that will be really helpful, and then we'll kick it off with the first presentation. So should we start with you, Steve?
Steve Smith. I'm with the United Way of Benton and Lincoln Counties. I'm the Community Engagement Director.
Rod Oss, current board president for United Way Benton and Lincoln Counties.
Alan Searle, Lincoln County Director, United Way Benton and Lincoln County.
So this would be the United Way of Benton and Lincoln County table. I'm Jennifer Moore, and I'm the Executive Director.
And if just to be helpful, the first person from an organization say what the main town is in your county. That would be helpful.
Corvallis.
Corvallis, okay.
Right. And Newport.
And Newport. Don't push anybody off by saying
I'm Kimberly Cooper, and I'm the project manager at this office.
Stacy Brown from Astoria, so Clatsop County, United Way. I'm the Executive Director.
Kathy Beck, United Way of Columbia County, Rainier, Oregon. I'm the Executive Director.
Jody Moss, Port Angeles, Washington, United Way of Clown County. I'm the Executive Director.
Elena Fracchia, United Way of Lane County in Eugene Springfield area, and I am the Director of Income and Investments.
Alan Walker, United Way of Chelan and Douglas Counties, Wenatchee, Washington, where you all meet on June 25th. And staff.
Mark Todd, United Way of Central Washington, that's Yakima and Kittitas counties in Washington State, and I'm the CEO.
Tyson King, United Way of Central Washington, and I'm the Community Investment Director.
And I'm Paul Knox with United Way of Thurston County, Olympia, Washington, and I'm the ED.
Good morning, I'm Jerry Wilkes. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at United Way of Snohomish County in Everett, Washington, and we got up at the butt crack of
Excuse me, nothing for me.
Jody's got you beat, I think.
That's funny.
Lindsay Agnew, Assistant to the Initiative Department at United Way of Snohomish County.
I'm Lynn Yara from United Way of Snohomish County. I'm the data manager.
Ken Wilhelm, I'm the ED, United Way of Deschutes County in Bend, Oregon. And I didn't get up at the butt crack of dawn, but I could see it. Greg Rowley, United Way of Lynn County, Albany, Oregon.
Nancy Albany, and I'm the campaign associate.
Valerie Fullerton from United Way of Lynn County, and I'm the Assistant Director.
Carrie Lemon, Shelton, Mason County Director.
Cassie Lovett, Knowledge Sharing Manager at United Way of Columbia-Willamette, right here. United Way of Grace Harbor, Pacific County, Langston, Somerville, and I'm the Business Manager, and we're out of Aberdeen.
Nora LeBlanc, United Way of Grace Harbor, Pacific County, Executive Director.
Jesse Brown, United Way of Thurston County, Development and Finance.
Sarah Coogan, I'm the Community Impact Coordinator at United Way of Thurston County, and I also work with Jen at United Way of the Pacific Northwest.
That deserves a round of applause.
We're sorry for you.
Kim Mample.
Total Supple from United Way of Snohomish County, Individual Giving and Donation, and Engagement Manager.
Stephanie Boston, Finance Director, United Way of California.
Columbia County's Director of Community Resource.
I am Kevin Peterson. I'm Financial Stability Manager at United Way of Snohomish County.
I am Brandy Rosebrooks. I'm the Marketing Director of United Way Blaine County.
I'm Katie Colburn. I'm the Community Resource Specialist at the United Way of Blaine County.
I'm Tony Esper, Administrator for the Impact and Community Investment Team at Snohomish County.
Amy Franklin, Impact Team at United Way of Snohomish County.
Adrian Whelan, also the Impact Team at Snohomish County.
Megan Barwell, same.
Mike Leonard, United Way of Pierce County, Tacoma, Washington, Resource Development Officer.
Robert Nathan, United Way of Walla Walla, Board President.
Jane Klemensky, United Way of Walla Walla, and I'm a board member.
I'm Deanne, United Way of Jackson County, Medford, Oregon, Executive Director.
Christy Llewellyn of Walla Walla County. Walla Walla is the main town, and Executive Director.
All right, I'm James McCormick. I am current board chair, United Way of Pierce County in Tacoma, Washington.
Good morning, Donna Panapinto, and I'm the CEO, United Way of Pierce County.
Good morning, Nalani Linder, United Way of Pierce County Community Impact Team.
Linda Nguyen, Vice Chair, same hometown.
I'm Nicole Milbrat, also with Pierce County, and I'm the marketing manager.
I'm Sean Patton, United Way of Pierce County, and I'm on the Impact Team.
Nola Renz, Pierce County Impact Team.
And Clara Teebridge, United Way of Pierce County, and I'm in our 211 call center.
Good morning, I'm Tammy Brown, and I'm with the Community Impact Team at United Way of Pierce County.
Good morning, I'm Alejandro Caral, Director of Systems Planning and Performance here at United Way of the Columbia-Willamette.
Hello, everybody. I'm Zeke Smith. I'm here with the United Way of the Columbia-Willamette in Portland, Oregon, and you'll hear from me later.
And I'm going to actually introduce this guy in just a second, but I want to tell you one logistical thing. Because we wanted to have the maximum amount of information today and get you out of town so that you don't have to spend the night, we have short amounts of breaks. So it's best if you get up and use the facilities as you need to today so that during our transition time we don't have a line out in the hall. But if you need the restroom, you'll see the keys right there on the wall next to Keith, and it's right by the front door out in the lobby, okay?
Keith did not introduce.
Keith is going to get introduced by this guy. So I have the pleasure now of introducing the board chair of United Ways of the Pacific Northwest, Dennis Smith, and he's the CEO of United Way of Snohomish County, and he has a few welcome words for you.
Thank you, Jim. Well, welcome everybody, and this is really very much of a historic moment. This is probably the first time since we became a regional United Way association that we've had this many folks from the two states gathered together. So, we really want to kind of mark that in. And so I wanted to check one thing out. We heard everybody introduce themselves, but everybody that's from Oregon, please stand up. I'll just give us a... So that gets that amount of the group. Okay, so you sit down, and then those from Washington.
Your whole town.
So we got, so we've got a good contingency from both states, and it was about the time I became vice chair of the region that discussions started to happen about the possibility of our two states becoming the first regional association within the United Way system. And someone asked me what I thought about it, and prior to joining United Way Snohomish County 15 years ago, I was a pastoral counselor before that, and was part of the Pacific Northwest region of the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, and so we were a two-state organization at that time. And I said, when I think back on that, there were so many people that were important to have relationships with from Oregon that I couldn't imagine having just a pastoral counseling group that was only Washington State based. I said there were so many gems that persons got to know in Oregon. And so I said, I bet there's gems in the United Way system down in Oregon. So, as we've merged, I've got to find out that that's clearly the case. Jim and I had the wonderful experience of flying down to Eugene, Oregon, where I spent the whole day telling them it was I had made a promise 45 years prior on an Oregon beach to some young hippie that I would someday visit Eugene, and I was finally making that wish come true. Met wonderful folks from the Oregon team, so we are thrilled to be one group. So let's give ourselves a great big hand. And the last thing I'm going to do, my team in Snohomish, they know that I tend to take a picture from time to time. In fact, they were grumbling as we walked in the door and took a picture out there. And my grandkids who call me Pop Pop often refer to me as Papa Parazzi. So I think this is an important picture to take. So I'm going to step back here and I want you all to get your biggest smiles on. And we're going to have a group picture of this wonderful gathering. So I think, Jim, you need to get back.
Alejandro, can you stand something in front of the screen real quick?
Coming. It's on its way.
I'm over here in the corner, that's not bothering. I can get most of it, that's all right. Everybody smile, wave, do something. Excellent, thank you all.
All right, take that, Ellen.
So I'm also really excited to finally, for the first time, come to United Way of Columbia-Willamette. I was hired to the United Way system by one Brent Stewart, who was the executive director at Snohomish. And 4 years after my hiring, he headed off and was stolen from us by some people down here in Portland. And not only that, he took a couple of people with him, like Carol and Mark, and also, so anyway, so it's nice to finally come down and here, and always been impressed by the work that's being done here at Columbia-Willamette. And in the past couple of years, I've been thrilled to get to know Keith and what Keith has brought to this community, his excitement, his passion, and thrilled that he's our vice chair. So Keith, turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So my job is to certainly welcome you all here. I'll echo what Dennis said. It is fun to see this come together as the kind of the United Way that bridges both states. We serve Southwest Washington and Clark County. This is meaningful to us, so thank you for making the journey. I look forward to coming to your communities in the years ahead. And my other job is to kind of tee up the presentation of the smart folks on our team to talk about the work we're doing in the community. I'm supposed to kind of give you the high-level overview, the origin story, how we got here, and I'm aware that many of you have kind of heard me do that shtick, either at the conference last year in Washington or at the Gates convening. So I'm going to try and condense a 10-minute kind of how we got here into 5 minutes. So I've been the CEO here for 3 years, and I will tell you that it is the most exciting opportunity I've ever had in my professional career. I spent 20 years working in the social sector, teaching in South Central LA, East Oakland, running a program for adjudicated youth, running a youth development organization here locally. And that was good work. I felt like I was making a difference for one kid, for a group of families, for one organization. By coming to United Way, I felt like after 20 years of kind of busting my tail, I had an opportunity to make a difference across a community, a region, to start to think about how we get population level change for the kids and families who really needed it. So 3 years in, or when I walked in the door, I took the helm of an organization like yours with a great brand. I mean, everyone knows United Way. And we had a good history in this community. For 100 years, we had been doing important work. And I had a community, staff, board, external stakeholders who were really thirsty for a different kind of United Way. They were looking for a United Way who could show up differently for and with the community. So in that regard, I had this mandate to honor the assets, the foundation, the good work we had done, but really think about how we reposition the organization for modern relevancy and impact. Both of which, when we were honest with ourselves, we had to say had been in decline for some time. So my first year, we spent a lot of time listening and talking to our stakeholders. our community partners, nonprofit CEOs, elected officials, policymakers, our donors, corporations, individuals, and really asking the question of, what role should United Way play to really get at change in our community? And it informed our strategic planning process. Our staff and our board kind of then huddled up for 6-8 months and really thought about how we want to mobilize an agenda in the community. And that's what we're going to talk about, but I'll kind of say, first and foremost, it began with an external focus. We knew if the 20th century United Way was the world's greatest fundraiser, we weren't interested in being that anymore. We wanted to become our community's problem solver, a powerful engine for social transformation, craft a vision for what's possible out in the community, and then raise resources behind that vision. Felt like the old model for United Way was, we'd come out as a fundraiser, woo, we want to raise $22 million this year. Why? Well, because it's bigger than 21. It was always like, well, we want the campaign to go up because bigger is better, but we could never really correlate that to tangible difference or change in the community. So by committing ourselves to lead with a vision for community transformation, that alone was a sea change, at least for our United Way. And then we had to think about, how are we going to be that community problem solver? And the cool epiphany, I think, for me and for us was, if in the 20th century we had been transactional, we'd raise a bunch of money, and then we'd give it away in the community to good organizations, but in effect write checks and say, send us a report 12 months from now. And we'd figure out kind of how to package that and talk about it. And it worked. I mean, it was serviceable in the 20th century. But again, when we looked at our own data, we felt like we were benefiting a lot of individual organizations, and we could look at the 200 or 300 kids or families they were serving. But when we looked externally at the community data, we saw we were losing ground as a region. Consistently over the 10 or 15 years prior, there were entrenched and pervasive disparities, educational, economic, and health disparities that were really getting worse in our community, and they were most acute in communities of color. So for us, as we thought about how do we start to go the next level and get at those real disparities, we thought first and foremost, it'll be about money. We'll continue to be a powerful investor in social sector work. But if we stop there, as we had in the 20th century, we're not using all the tools in our toolbox. So we started to think about the other assets we had available to us. And this is you're gonna recognize this as collective impact. But we saw that we could augment our investments in a community agenda by mobilizing strategic volunteers. We have the Volunteer Center, Hands On Greater Portland. How could we amplify the work of our partners through mobilizing strategic volunteers? We also can play an important role for the social sector through the aggregation of data, making meaning of data and making it actionable in a way that, frankly, our partners simply didn't have the bandwidth. We could be a knowledge hub for our partners. We also had the ability to leverage additional resources to the work, to find co-funders and partners who wanted to invest in a broad community agenda with us, so that it's not a unilateral United Way agenda, it's a community agenda. And finally, and this was the big one for us, and we're still working through it with our board, we have the ability to move a policy and advocacy agenda. As we set to work with our community partners to address a specific issue, we can then take our learnings to policymakers and talk about where there are systemic barriers that get in the way of our moving kids and families out of poverty. We've got to use that tool ultimately to get to some of the real impediments to transformation in the community. So for us, that was the framework. We knew whatever our issue was going to be, we wanted to be a more active partner. We thought of it as like the air traffic controller. We want to build a team of high-quality partners, and then we'll use our ability to be a convener to bring them together in an aligned way so that resources start to meld with all those other things I talked about. And my final segue will be, so it became the what. what's our issue area? We knew we wanted to focus. The 20th Century United Way had kind of been a mile wide and an inch deep. And again, I think that worked in the 20th century. We were kind of, we played that role as the community big tent. But increasingly, for all those people who know United Way, but don't have any idea what we really do, we felt like we had to focus. We had to put a marker down, identify an issue in the community, point to a summit about what's possible, and then enroll, mobilize the community to work on that issue over an extended period of time. We identified that issue first and foremost through listening to the community. As I said, we asked people, what do you think really matters? How can we make a real difference? And second, data. We're committed to being a data-driven organization. And when we looked at the data, particularly the implications for kids and families in poverty in our region, it was astounding to us. When we started this work, 40% of kids in our metro region were living in families either designated as low income or in poverty. And that stopped us in our tracks. I mean, again, I taught in South Central, East Oakland, where the real poverty is. When we sort of said, wait a minute, nearly half of the kids in our region are growing up in families that are making choices every day between rent and food, or a car payment to get to work, or a doctor visit for a sick kid. We've got a significant issue, and if we don't disrupt the trajectory of those nearly half of kids in our region, and they grow up to become adults in poverty with kids of their own, we simply can't afford the cost. The exponential growth in government and social sector costs 10, 15, 20 years out will be staggering. So for us at United Way, we looked at an array of data. That was the point that led us to say enough is enough. We made a 10-year commitment, and I applaud my board for that. Again, we were really looking for new ways of work. We wanted to kind of break the mold and approach this differently. And the first thing we said is, you don't get after poverty in 1 or 3 year tranches. We're going to make this a journey that will take the community on. 10-year commitment to focus our assets, our resources, our partnerships on breaking the cycle of childhood poverty in our region. We knew that it couldn't be just about kids. So we looked at research and data nationally and saw a lot of innovation around 2-generation approaches. Investing in kids, helping to stabilize their academic experience, get them that high school diploma so they're career and college ready. But if we stop there, we know it's not enough. Too many of those kids go home, sleep in a car at night, don't get a healthy meal, don't get access to care. So we wanted to build a strategy that starts to array around those kids' families the stable housing they need, the economic opportunity and asset development they need, the access to care that we know both stabilizes families and allows kids to be learning every day. So our Breaking the Cycle commitment is really about kids, families, and communities. How do we start to strengthen the fabric of our most impoverished communities? How do we deliver services not at them, but with them? How do we acknowledge that many of the solutions and assets that these communities need, particularly our rich, diverse communities of color, exist in those communities? And how do we play a role to amplify their voice and choice in creating solutions? We're a year in, it's hard work. I will close and turn it over to Zeke by telling you this. When I do these speeches, what I know is, I'm lousy at a lot of things. I'm an okay speaker, and people are like, oh, that's so cool, right on. And it is. We believe in it, but I'll shoot you straight. The old model is easier. That old model where we'd pick a few nonprofits, we'd invest in them individually, and we could go talk to our donor about, hey, here's the great work SEI is doing with these 200 kids. It felt good. It sort of appealed. I could show them an individual kid. This new model, where we're building a cohort of 50 of the highest quality partners, asking them to work together systemically with us across sectors, across brands, to create population level outcomes, hard, messy, imperfect. Not easy in 2 minutes when I got line workers at Freightliner who want to hear the stick to articulate systems change in a way that gets at the head and the heart, all of which we're working through, and I believe we will get to. But this year, uniquely, I think our fundraisers and even Zeke and his team felt like we're kind of in the it gets harder before it gets better phase, where we're kind of co-creating with our partners, figuring out the indicators we're looking at. So no, as you hear this, the commitment, you know, there have been times when my board's gotten a little squirrely, like what's the North Star? Is it high school graduation? Well, we're working through that with our partners. Like, know that this kind of work really is about a long-term journey, and I can't think of more right work for a United Way, and I'm excited to see how it ends. So with that, I will turn it to Zeke and his team to kind of frame the mechanism, the scaffolding we're building.
So one thing I've learned about Dennis is that he's smart enough to go before Keith as a speaker. And I'm the guy who always gets caught going after Keith. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is I do not have the same energy that he does. And I've worked with him long enough to know not to try to have the same energy. So we will accommodate for that through a couple of different means. One of those is we're scheduled to talk with you till 11:35. That means it's another hour and 10 minutes. In that period of time, we're going to do some talking at you, just so you have some information. But I really want to make sure that there's an opportunity to have real dialogue and discussion. You get the chance to both ask some questions and to provide some input as we think collectively about collective impact. So that'll be one way that I won't just sit up here for 60 or 70 minutes and talk at you, which he could do, but usually we don't let him. The second thing I'll say is, the other part of following Keith, it has to do with this story that he was telling too, which is, you know, what he described very quickly for you was a really new and different vision for our organization. And he's the right messenger to share what the vision is, as he said. And we're at a point where people really want to know what implementation looks like. You know, do they really want to know what it looks like? No, but they want to know that there is some credibility and some real traction and some real progress that's occurring. And that's the space that we're in as a staff as we think about the work we're doing. And it's really what we wanted to share with you today. So in some ways, what we wanted to do is kind of pick up the hood and show you a little bit of what the engine looks like. And part of what that means is there's a couple spots in there that we think are pretty shiny because we've spent some extra time buffing them. And there's some other spots in there that are kind of messy. We may have a couple of leaks in the line, so we might find that as we're going through this process together. But know that we're intentionally going under the hood in a way that we wouldn't typically if we were trying to sell you the car. So this is not a donor spiel that we're going to give you today. This is a conversation among peers from other United Ways about how we're approaching the complex work that Keith talked about. So a couple of logistics. One, this room it like swings broadly in temperature, and I'm not quite sure why, because I don't think there's even actually a heater in here that works. But it can get really hot. If it does, let's open the other two doors so anybody should feel like they have the kind of, you are liberated to help us manage the temperature in the room. We're in Portland, Oregon, so you can relax a bit. So if you want to take your jacket off, roll up your sleeves, feel free to do that as well. Nobody will mind. So just kind of take care of yourselves in the space, because this room is intentionally cozy and intimate, but that means that it gets hot, and we got to take care of ourselves. So do that. And there was other logistic piece. So there are a number of folks who couldn't make it today, but really wanted to have an opportunity to hear what we talked about. So we have a camera in the corner. Those of you that are presenting know that the camera is there. And then what I'm going to say, even though it might feel a little awkward in this room, because I think we can pretty much hear each other, is that when folks ask questions, presenters might consider rephrasing the question just so that the camera can hear it, because I think actually we'll have a harder time hearing people in the back. We should be fine in terms of the vocals up here or the audio up here, but just think about that as you're presenting. And I'm not going to ask people in the back of the room to shout, because that'll feel weird, because we actually can't hear you. But we're trying to do some taping as well for other folks. So here's what I want to ask you to do for the next 2 minutes. I want you to turn to your neighbors at your table, and I want to know a little bit about what you are interested in hearing about as it relates to collective impact. That's really the question that we were asked to talk about, because it becomes the frame for which we are implementing all of our work. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but before we jump into it, I'd love to just hear from folks what it is that you might be interested in. So take 2 minutes at your table. I'm going to do this at different points. So when I say 2 minutes, I'll say, okay, you got another 30 seconds. And whether that was actually 2 minutes or not, don't worry about it. But when I say you got 30 seconds, then I'll say, all right, now I need to get your attention back to the front of the room. And when I do that, let's do it as quickly as possible, just so that we can really get through the conversation. But part of the reason I'm doing this is so that everybody has an opportunity to engage a little bit. So 2 minutes with your neighbors. When you think about collective impact, what do you want to know from us today?
How they can be, I mean, it's all the hows, right? We're here for the nuts and bolts, is what I want to know. And then the tips, like what didn't work, and what worked, pitfalls to avoid, what staffing support, what's the background economic support to do it, right? Because it's a big body. I think nuts and bolts, tips of the trade.
And that's that presentation.
You got it. What's the messaging? Yeah, how did you get the community excited?
And he said they want to know what's the shtick, but you can't give it to them. It's so much more complex than that.
Simply, how to target. Yeah, simply. The main things you have to pass internally, and if it's not, if you don't have to pass internally, how do you use other partners to buy in on this?
In about 30 more seconds.
Yeah, what if they have marketing stuff? I mean, everybody here, it seems like you can call and say, can I see your stuff and what you get?
Okay.
Do you do that regularly to call your peers and stuff? Yeah.
Let's come back to the full group. Don't worry about the time. Believe me, I know the time better than you do. At least until 11:35.
Somebody who knows what you're saying.
All right, so before I'm going to ask you all to share with me some of your thoughts about what you're interested in. But before you do, I'm going to pass out 2 different documents. And I'm going to do that. One is a campaign, really kind of brochure that talks about our work. And the second one is a list of our funded partners. I'm going to do that because we're going to do a pretty high flyover at the kind of what's the problem we're trying to address level, and how are we going about it in terms of like who are we funding and who are our partners. And we're going to do that so that we can get a little deep into some specifics around some of the work we're doing. But I think this is kind of good context for you to have. So as you're kind of giving me feedback on what you want to hear, pass these back to people along the way. All right, so just kind of popcorn style with my pen. There it is. Popcorn style, what came up in your conversations? What questions are you interested in hearing more about?
Is it just mine?
Yeah.
One is just the down and dirty about how working with key stakeholders and dealing with the politics and egos of that, and showing leadership, but not, the tension between showing leadership and not being the full leader that also involves when that happens.
Oh, we don't have any politics or
Well, that's good, huh?
Okay, I think we will talk about that a good bit. What else?
Launch logistics.
Launch logistics.
Like
Give me a little bit more.
putting your stake in the ground. Old way, done.
Yep.
We're on this path, we're committed, new way. How you transitioned in that language, talking about it, getting people to be on your page
Great.
in like 2 minutes. You know, that 2-minute attention span you get.
Yep. You will get a firsthand sense of how well we do that. Yeah.
Getting community leaders engaged in a way that's meaningful for them in topics that they may not think that, well, what can I do? What's my job in being a partner?
And when you are speaking of community leaders, I'm thinking you're talking about folks who are kind of traditional community leaders, so electeds and kind of influence makers. How do we engage them in this process?
Yeah.
Volunteer engagement. Okay.
Getting the board on board.
Getting and keeping.
Yeah, keeping.
Because with Keith, you can get them on board really easily, and then they're like, "Where's the food? Where's the food?" And then I've got to feed them.
Yeah.
Okay, others?
I don't know how true this is with other communities. In ours, we have at least 2 other collective impact initiatives.
Yeah.
And we have a statewide collective impact initiative, all of which says we are the umbrella and come to the table. And so sorting that out
Yeah.
as we continue to want to do our good work.
That is a great question. And you know, part of the balance in the room here too is like, we're in Portland, Oregon, and there are only a couple of other communities across the 2 states that look like ours. Yours is one of them. So we have I mean, that is definitely an acute problem and opportunity for us. And we know that it isn't for some others too. So we'll try to balance a little bit who's in the room
But
and
for
which
others,
questions.
I think it's the message that, of what they perceive United Way to be versus what we are now.
Right. So old perception, new reality.
We all kind of have some questions around maybe just the more practical logistical operations. And what do you do with your grants and
Yep.
applications and grants processes? How does that work in real time?
So you're going to get some of that very deeply. It may or may not respond to what you're looking for. So if it doesn't, as we get into the dialogue, ask some specific questions. We're going to skip over kind of quickly the kind of RFP process, the grant making process we use to get to the set of grantee partners we have now, even though it was a long and intentional and very visible and transparent process. So if you want to hear a little bit more about that along the way, just let me know.
Following up on the alignment with other CI work, a specific conversation, if possible, about working with the organizations that are engaged in that. So if there's another organization in your community that's doing collective impact, how you function at that how those relationships work.
Yep.
Not just on the initiative.
And I can tell you a bit about that. If it doesn't come up in our initial conversation, ask me.
Great.
Others? Yeah.
And I know you're so well to know this, but the impact and strategies around resource development, i.e. fundraising, in this new phase you're putting out there.
Which is really where we're pretty deep on that right now, in a good way. So last August when the product development training came to Washington, we sent a team up there, and we've really been using that frame, I think for the first time probably ever, to be honest. We've got our impact team, our finance administration folks, and our resource development team working really hard together on how we take the stuff we're going to talk about and put it into a format that makes sense in our resource development work. So really building a set of RD products that align with the work we're doing in a much deeper way, I think, than has been done before. So, and that's challenging, to say the least, but it's also really exciting. Yeah.
What are the new resource development skills that you're seeing you need to be able to do that successfully?
same research development camp?
Good question. It's hard to talk about collective impact if you don't really know what, if you haven't felt it. And that comes up a lot. So I just put RD competencies. So this stuff we might talk about, we might not, but you guys will push us in your questions. I'm gonna take one more and then I'm gonna jump in.
I just asked that you expand it to all different competencies as you've gone through this journey, not just research development.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So see how we do. But like I said, if you don't hit something that you specifically want to hear a little bit more about, let me know. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes and give kind of an overview of how we're using collective impact as a framework. I'll use some of the language that's kind of out there around collective impact and contextualize it to what we're doing around a specific, one of our specific funding and strategies initiatives. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of burliest knot in the middle of that right now for us, which is about shared data measuring progress. And Alejandro Caral is going to share kind of where we are in that process and what it looks like for us, given the environment we operate in. So.
And I'm going to send you all the slide decks and the contact information for the presenters, so don't feel like you have to catch all the words on the screen.
You heard this from Keith, but thought it was important to say if we were going to do kind of, you know, part of that 2-minute spiel is what's the problem and then what are the solutions, right? So I'm going to skip over the problem for the most part because you heard a little bit of it from Keith. But as he said, now he actually said 40% of kids living in low-income households. This question of low income versus poverty, what does poverty really mean? It's an old rating. Comes up for us. So as we're trying to speak in 2 minutes and define some of the terms we're working with, that's been part of our complexity, is what are the terms we're actually going to use and how does that make sense for people. But 1 in 5 kids in our area are in poverty. It's pretty universal across the region. So even though we feel like we live in really different communities in our metro area, and we cover, most of you know this, but Multnomah County here, Washington County to the west, Clackamas County to the kind of southeast, and then Clark County across the river in Washington. So kind of different communities, but this poverty issue is pretty pervasive. It's also pervasive that it's most acute in communities of color across that area, and as we know, it's both growing and it's a multi-generational problem. We went through a long process to kind of elevate this. Our board said, all right, let's make breaking the cycle of childhood poverty our audacious goal. So that becomes the kind of frame, and this is really, I think, important as we think about what's the difference between collective impact, as we're trying to engage a bunch of folks around this work, and what we thought of as collaboration previously. Part of it is having this kind of laser-like focus on a kind of community-level goal that we can all agree to as a piece of what we want to address. We have a set of different investment strategies that are guiding the way that we're going about this, some of which are where we use our traditional RUM resources around a set of new strategies. We're going to go deep on community strengthening. Community transformation has its own collective impact story that's really interesting, and Community Safety Net does as well. Safety Net is more or less kind of a pull-through of some of our more traditional approaches, so it's a place where we're funding things like short-term rent assistance, 211, earned income tax credit programming. We're funding some work around supporting acute medical needs of populations that still don't have insurance. So we've continued to see a place in our work for safety net investment. One of the things we're doing there that's interesting and exciting is trying to create a collective impact frame there with those partners about how do we actually become a safety net and not just a set of individual actors that are working on different pieces of the puzzle. Community transformation, we put out a 5-year commitment of $3.75 million over the 5 years. That's the largest kind of single investment that we've made as an organization. And I get that scale looks different in different communities, but for us, even that was a big lift to put into one single commitment. We said we wanted to invest in a collaborative, an existing collaboration, but one that we could apply this new approach, both in terms of how we want to invest, but also in terms of how we want to roll up our sleeves and be a part of the process moving forward. We're investing with a collaborative called Successful Families 2020. This is on your sheet too. It's a set of community-based organizations. 5 of them are culturally specific organizations. One of them is more of a large mainstream social service organization. And they said what we want to do is we want to break the cycle in communities of color specifically. To do that, we want to elevate and validate the work of our culturally specific providers already. We know that they're getting outsized outcomes for people in their communities beyond what other organizations are doing. So let's make that visible. And then as we're doing that, let's think about how we can pull some of those learnings, some of those best practices, and scale them across other organizations like this mainstream provider that's part of this collaborative, but also outside of the collaborative. And the idea there that came from them is that we won't be able to solve the problems of poverty within just a set of culturally specific organizations that currently exist. We need everybody to shift the way they're engaging with communities of color. And we feel like we've got an ability to be a part of the solution, not just within our organizations. And so we're really excited about what that presents. It's a 5-year process. It's not just about the investment, but we're actually at the table and in fact have become the backbone to that collaboration as we think about collective impact. Community strengthening you'll hear a bit more about. We are the early learning hub convener. In Oregon, we have these hubs as a way to frame our local systems. Lane County is also a hub convener. We're the convener for Multnomah and Washington counties. There are 15 of those around the state. They are intentionally both from the state's guidance, but also at a local level, a collective impact effort in terms of how you bring different sectors to the table to really address the needs of 0 through 6-year-olds. When I started a couple of years ago, after Keith, we actually merged with our local volunteer center, our hands-on Greater Portland. So they are now a part of our work, which really grounded our perspective and our approach to volunteer engagement. And now we're deeply involved in thinking about how that work is more connected to and tied to breaking the cycle of childhood poverty specifically. So with that, in essence, so this is how we talk about our strategies. And one of our difficulties as we engage in thinking about engaging our donors is they're not really that interested in specific investment strategies. I mean, they're interesting, but they each kind of sound like a set of different parts. And no matter how much we kind of try to put it together, it doesn't really create that kind of fabric that Keith talked about as he talked about successful families, successful students, family stability, and connected communities. And so part of what we're in the process of is figuring out how do we start to create a picture that people can understand that really talks about the relationship between efforts and interventions to support students, their families, and the community at large, and how that really begins to frame the way we think about breaking the cycle of childhood poverty. So this picture, and you'll see this when you get the slides, there's specific data in here. Most of it's actually real. But for the purpose of what we're doing, think of this as an illustrative picture. What's funny about that? This comes out of our community strengthening effort. And so these are all data points about work that's about data that came from our 30 community strengthening partners. What we want to be able to do is begin to create a picture where our community at large can understand the relationship between this big, kind of bold, hairy, audacious goal, breaking the cycle, and the work that our partners are doing on the ground. As we're going about that, one of the big changes that we made is we're investing in primarily general operating support. So we are no longer investing in direct program investments. We haven't defined a set of programs that we specifically are looking to fund. We believe that we want to fund organizations that are doing quality work towards breaking the cycle of childhood poverty. So we went through an extensive grant-making process to identify which organizations have evidence that they've been addressing key outcomes and indicators that we know impact childhood poverty. Think of these as outcomes and indicators: third grade reading standards, 10th graders on track to graduate, folks retaining housing for 6 months or more. So we had a set of indicators that we put out, said, tell us how you're working on these issues, provide us with evidence that you know that you've been able to track some of your data, and we want to find 30 organizations that we can invest in over a 3-year period of time. We're providing those organizations with general operating support, so it's roughly about $50,000 a year per organization. And what we've said is, we've gone through a vetting process to identify whether or not you're working on the right issues and working towards breaking the cycle. And we believe you have a better understanding of where this resource should go to continue to do that work than we do. So we want you to use those dollars to accelerate what you're doing. We want to know how you're doing that, but we're not going to tell you where to put those resources. In exchange, we want you to be a part of a learning community where we're going to both think about how individual organizations are making progress towards addressing childhood poverty, and collectively how we might work more effectively to accelerate our ability to address those issues. So in exchange for the general operating support and your ability to keep doing the work you're doing, you're a part of a learning community. And to kind of feed that learning community, we're going to ask you for a pretty significant amount of data twice a year. And you'll hear more about that as we go through the slides. Yeah?
So it sounds like you identified a capacity. We're going to have 30 organizations of people competing for the 30 slots, rather than looking to the community saying these are all the people doing this work, and that happens to be 30. Is that correct?
Yeah,
So how did you settle on why 30?
Money.
Why is that the 99?
Money and capacity. So it was two questions. One was, how much money can we invest in this particular strategy, given what our resources will look like over time? And then two, there's an implicit, and it's become more explicit, expectation about how much capacity we have as a staff to be able to support that work. So it's not just kind of like go in a learning community and kind of go off in a corner and then come back and tell us what you want. And you'll see that we're providing kind of the backbone of that work. So much more than 30, it felt like it would be, that'd be hard work, and 30 is hard work to do. If the staff, I mean, Alejandro could say this, but other staff would say, Cassie could agree, that it's hard enough with the 30 we have. So it was a little bit of a guessing game in terms of like what's the right amount of people in a room, and then what capacity do we have from a resource standpoint. Yeah.
So when you went to organizations and asked them about these indicators, were these indicators that they were generally already tracking, or did you give groups a chance to sift through their data or to look at it a different way? And then how did you validate that?
So I'm going to do a quick answer in terms of the front end of our process, and then Alejandro is going to talk to you much more deeply about both the data we got back, what we can do with that and what we can't do with that, and how that's guiding the way we're working with our partners as we move forward. But the short answer on the front is we put together a set of indicators that largely are ones that you'd look at and go, yeah, I get the relationship between that and poverty, or I've seen the research that ties high school graduation to poverty rates over time and other issues along the way. So we put together a set of indicators with a pretty good kind of look at the research to say there's a relationship between these and between poverty broadly. We then, through our grant making process, we put them out to the public, including all the folks that might potentially want to apply for resources, and we said, how do you think this looks as a set of indicators? And we got a lot of feedback from people, and it did shift some of the indicators that we ended up putting in our framework. So that was, first of all, being really transparent about the change we were making was really important. Partly because we wanted input, partly because it was a big shift, and people kind of didn't believe we were making the shift and needed to know a little bit more about it. We then, as we asked for them to apply, we didn't say, you have to show us that you are tracking 10th graders on track to graduate in this specific way. So we distinguished, and I won't go too deep, Alejandro can if it makes sense, but we made a distinction between kind of an indicator and a metric. And we said there might be different ways you are measuring that indicator, and what we want to know is, how are you measuring it? What we found, which we kind of knew, but is important to the story that Alejandro will tell, is that a lot of people are measuring things like third grade reading, but they're all measuring it in different ways. And so part of the question as we think about shared data and metrics moving forward is, how do we take somewhat messy data, and there's reasons for it, and try to turn it into a clean story about making progress on something like third grade reading, which gets to, I think, your question, and you'll hear more about that. So I want to talk to you about how we're applying collective impact in the implementation. So as we're now working with these 30 organizations. So I skipped a lot about how we got to the 30 organizations, but assume at this point we're with them. And it's now about how do we do the work together over a 3-year period of time. Our first year has been a lot about building a work plan collectively. And part of the, I think, collective impact story or truth in terms of what you need to do is figure out the distinction or figure out the balance between co-creation. So where is it about kind of bringing the right players to a table and then building a common agenda and building a shared understanding of the work you're going to do? And where is it about leading? It's this question of, when are you leading and what's the right amount of leadership versus kind of walking in the room and saying, here's what we're going to do, here's how it's going to be accomplished, everybody do your work. Because that's not really, A, that's not collective impact, and B, we don't believe that will work in terms of addressing an intractable issue like breaking the cycle of childhood poverty. So we've kind of walked this kind of dance between how much structure do we apply to the process. It is a process we led, so let's be clear about that. I mean, we said breaking the cycle of childhood poverty was important to us. We did that based on input and data from the community, but we put that out there. And we put the framework around how many partners are we going to work with, what kind of investment are we going to make. So let's be explicit about the role we're playing in that regard as a funder and kind of a starter of the process. But where do we build in the opportunity for co-creation? So this first year has been a lot about co-creation and using this collective impact approach to do it. So those of you who've looked at collective impact, we talk a lot about common agenda, shared measurement or data systems, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and kind of backbone support or governance. I will pause and say the language is also changing, right? Because we're right in the middle of it. So we find this is from you can't really read this back there. I don't expect that you can, but I'll tell you the parts that I was hoping you'd pay attention to. But this is from a recent Stanford Social Innovation Review article by Jeff Edmondson, who's from the Strive Foundation, and Ben Hecht, who I think is with FSG, but I don't quite remember. But two of the guys who are helping to shape the way we think about collective impact nationally. And they are starting to change the language a bit. So common agenda, shared measurements, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, backbone support. We just kind of collectively started to say, okay, we understand what those things are. And now they're talking about it a little differently. But it's the same stuff. So it's about shared community vision, it's about evidence-based decision-making, collaborative action, and then investment and sustainability. This is really about kind of what's your governance to make sure you can move this thing forward. This is about mutually reinforcing activities. This is about how you're using data to really drive the work you're doing. And this is about shared vision or aligned kind of where you're headed. So, but the reason I put this up here is because the thing I like about this chart, and you'll see this when you look at, when Jim sends the slides out, is it really breaks down kind of what does it look like to be working on those areas in a collective impact process in different phases of the work. So they've broken it down into an exploring phase, an emerging phase, a sustaining phase, and then where do you start to really see the kind of change that you're trying to accomplish. And for us, this framework has been helpful as we've thought about, well, where are we in this collective impact process with our community strengthening partners? And we're largely in this space in here. It looks a little different by different pillars, right? We've got a pretty shared vision, and we'll tell you in a second a little bit more about what that is. Big knot for us is how do we actually get the right data and how do we align around what we're doing with that data to really drive the way we make decisions moving forward. We've got some sense of how we're starting to build out the bottom pieces. But as you think about collective impact, I think that particular framework in the article that it comes from, which is called Defining Quality Collective Impact, is pretty powerful. And Mark, I think you actually sent me this initially, so thanks for moving us in that direction. So I said most of this, 30 organizations, 3-year commitment, general operating support. We've broken into 3 learning communities. I'll tell you what those are. We're focused on data and reporting and really thinking about organizational capacity, and then ultimately, and this is the piece that everybody gets really excited about in the room, is how do we start to build a collective systems, policy, and advocacy agenda. That has been probably more important in some ways than the money has in terms of keeping people at the table. It's this idea that we've got 30 really diverse organizations and the United Way and the kind of broad table that we can set that potentially can come together and say, what do we collectively care about, and how do we start changing the systems around us to make sure that we can accomplish what we're trying to accomplish? Which gets a little bit at this question of how community leader engagement. We're not fully there yet on this particular initiative, but as we start to build out a sense of what are some of the issues we want to tackle together, that question will become really, really important. How are we going back in the local community? How are we going back in our state communities to really start to advocate and address some of those issues? And then our first deliverable for this, as we think about our board and our donors, will be a baseline report about what we're learning from this process. So built into this whole idea is that we will be able to pull out new knowledge and information as a product, as a deliverable that we can share more broadly. And if that's not true, then a lot of this falls apart. So I'll just say that out loud. So one of the measures of success for us is, can we keep the folks that are engaged at the table? And can we keep them at the table because they believe they can learn something there that will improve their practice? And if so, can we then pull that out so that we can share that more broadly in the community that we operate in? This is pretty fundamental for us, even though it's wonky and it's hard to talk to donors about, because it's the place where we think we ultimately have the most value in the process as United Way, right? Because you could just kind of invest in and get out of the way. You could just kind of, you could just become the designation machine that we're all starting to become. But we've somehow got to define our value add in this process. Like, what is it that we're doing that makes sense for people to give us resources that we can use in this way? And that, we think, is a lot dependent upon our ability to start to pull out information that is important, not just to those that are being funded, but is important more broadly in the community as well.
Zeke, I have a question. Do you have partners beyond the 30 organizations that are participating in that learning community, individuals from other groups that just aren't funded but want to be part of the learning group?
We don't at the moment. We both have organizations that applied that didn't get selected as one of the 30 that have said it wasn't about the money for us, we just want to be a part of a collective impact effort. How can we play? We've had other funders who said we're really interested because we were intentional about bringing other funders in our community along the way in terms of what we're doing. So we've had other funders who said we want to be able to be either a fly on the wall or we want to be a part of this process. We're invested in trying to figure out how they can co-fund and be a part of that process, but they're not yet to date. And then we have other kind of big actors, right? So our Multnomah County is really interested in what this work is, and they want to know how to align it with some of the work that they're doing around after-school programming and supports for kids. They're also not at the table yet. So what we did intentionally is say, we've got to build the structure for this cohort first, and internally, we got to build the trust, we got to build the sense of like, what are we doing together and how are we going to do it? But we know, and we've said this explicitly with our partners, that we want to create the space for other folks to be able to come along and connect to it. We're not there yet, and we don't quite know what that looks like. Is it just you open the door one day and say, come on in? Probably not. So what's the structure of the process for kind of building a broader movement and a broader continuum of folks around this? Not there yet.
So that actually raises another question, because how do you get from, we already have a bunch of people at the table and we want to transition to, do you disinvite? It doesn't feel good.
Well, so we've made a 3-year commitment to the organizations. We're going to fulfill that. And part of what's important there is, so we're collecting data from them, right? We've asked them to do reporting. We've asked them to tell us how they're, and then we'll see in a second, it's reporting in a number of fields, but some of it is similar to what you would think of, so it's outcome reporting, right? But we've not said to them, if you don't meet your objectives in year 1, we're going to sit down and have a conversation with you and decide whether or not you can stay a part of this process. So it's not an accountability reporting framework, it's a learning framework. And the intent with that is to say, we've made this 3-year commitment, you're in the mix, as long as you're participating, you're going to continue to be a part of what we're doing together, because we want to create a framework where we can actually have real dialogue, where they can bring their mistakes or their issues or concerns to the table as much as they can bring their successes and their best practices to the table. At the end of 3 years, part of the question for us is where are we at this point in our journey, and who's still with us, and how do we move forward? So we've actually said by 3 years, we're not thinking that at the end of that we're going to kind of say, oh, we're done, that was great, that was one thing, let's put it away, now let's start something new. We may reinvest with all 30. We may not reinvest with all 30, it may be 20, it may be 15. So what we'll have to do, and we'll do it with them, is identify kind of where are we in the process and who's still working with us to be able to move forward. And I would imagine it won't be all 30, and that there will be some other folks that we can bring to that table at that point too.
Hey Z.
Yeah.
I know you guys are part of the Gates building community practically. Sounds almost like their model. I mean, the approach that they're taking with those communities.
Yeah, so there's a number of us in the room on the Washington side who are a part of the building community philanthropy work that the Gates Foundation has been investing in over the last few years. We've learned a lot from them about how they've gone about their process. And we've also found ourselves at times where we're like, did we pick that up from them, or how come those are so well aligned? But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things we did learn from them is there's not the same kind of pressure on the grantees around how can you tell us exactly what you're doing with the dollars today, and if you can't get to your outcomes that you said you were going to get to, then maybe we're not going to reinvest. That reckoning comes. There is an accountability in the process, but it's not in the immediate. We've said we're going to stick with you if you stick with us in the same way that they do. Yeah. So generally our shared vision is breaking the cycle of childhood poverty, right? But that's at such a high level. It's important, I think, and this I think is real for most collective impact efforts, to kind of get underneath that and say, okay, so what does that specifically mean for the work that we're going to do together? So what's important about what you see here is that our focus as we think about our work with the 30 organizations is on organizational and collective capacity and creating culture responsive systems. So we want to see improvement within organizations that are involved in this work. We want to see improvement collectively in the 30 organizations and the collective that we've built around how we do our work and the practices we have to impact the cycle of childhood poverty. And we also want to build the capacity for a system that more effectively addresses the needs of the populations that we know are most likely to be in poverty. So part of what we've started to do as we work with this group and build the work plan is break out kind of what are the levels of engagement and what are the levels of improvement that we hope to see over time.
When you talk about organizational collective capacity, does the word competence come up? Competence of the I mean, is there a mentoring process here also that you could talk about a little bit?
Yeah, so I think it'll be built into the, whoa, that was cool. It'll be built into our work plan as we move through it. We haven't specifically, I don't know that the words competence or mentoring has come up. I will say we don't look at it as us necessarily providing technical assistance to the partners who are on the table, but we are trying to create a space where partners can do more peer-to-peer learning, and they're really interested in that as well. And we've got really different sized organizations that are involved in this. We've got kind of large mental health organizations, and we've got really small kind of after-school programs that work with Hispanic kids in Clackamas County. And for some of those smaller organizations, they're excited about being at the table with these kind of larger institutions, and trying to figure out how you create the space for the right conversations to occur there is really big, and is a key part of it. And then how we pull, for us, how we create that space and then pull out what we learned from how you do that effectively is part of where we think we pull out some knowledge as we move forward. So this is really the kind of framework that we're thinking about. And this gets at that mission. It's about kind of building mutually reinforcing activities that impact the way that organizations are able to do their work. It's also about kind of building some learning products that we can share at a community level. And all of it is about thinking about quality improvement inside your organizations and across the collective. There are 3 ways that we're getting at that work. We're thinking about data specifically. What role does data play inside your organization, in the collective, and in the community to make sense of the impact that we're trying to have? We're thinking about racial equity. You've heard that in what we're talking about. And we're thinking about policy and advocacy work, upstream involvement. How are we intentional about creating capacity inside of organizations and across the system to try to tackle some of those issues that get in the way of breaking the cycle of childhood poverty, even if what you're doing in an organization is really effective with the population you're working with. So there's a set of goals that we've identified there to be able to accomplish that. It's another one of those slides you're not supposed to read, but it's really colorful, so you get a sense of it. But in essence, we've created a theory of change that underneath each of those areas, data and evaluation, racial equity, and then upstream involvement, that says, here's a set of strategies we're engaged in collectively so that we can get to some of these short-term outcomes, which ultimately we think has this kind of an impact on the work we're doing. So this is a good slide to look at. I'm sorry you won't look at it right now, but it gives you kind of a more detailed sense of how collectively, and all that I'm sharing with you right now, this is the co-creation space. We didn't do this alone and bring it to them and say, here's what you're going to do. This was where we spent the last 8 months with a small group of those partners, and then going back to the full group and saying, does this look like what we think we're going to do? Does this look like you can make organizational commitment to working on this together? So that we're going to come back to measurement. Alejandro is going to talk about that because this is the kind of the burl that we've run into as we've been sawing through the log. It's another one of those places where I didn't know we had such cool transitions. So in some ways, this is kind of one of those spaces where you can start to say, okay, this is looking like process, but it's also a fundamental part of the work we've done. How do we articulate the relationship between work that's going to be happening now in a set of learning communities? So 30 partners now become 10, 10, and 10 in smaller communities, focused on successful students as a frame, stable families, and connected communities, but each of them working on each of these areas around data sharing, racial equity, and upstream involvement. How do we take those smaller learning communities and ensure that it feeds up into the larger cohort and tie it all together? So for us as a backbone, A, the ability to articulate what this is, and then B, to actualize it really matters. So our job, well, I'll get there in a second. Our job as the backbone is to create the charter for the work that's being done at the learning community level, to build a clear agenda to move that work forward, to take care of things like the facilitation and the logistics of the meeting. So, you know, one of the issues in collaboratives or in collective impact work is like, who's going to be responsible for making sure we get together, for codifying what we're talking about, for getting a space for us. So part of our job is we'll take care of that. You've got to commit as an organization to participate. We'll take care of those logistics, including record keeping. We'll be tracking progress. And even though it's a small bullet here, we're collecting data from all the organizations. And then in each of those learning communities, we're going to be giving that data back to them, not just in mass. We're going to say, we're going to do some analysis of the data, figure out where there are some key questions and issues from that, bring it back to them and say, how do you make sense of what we're seeing here? And how does that help shape the way we think about what we want to do differently as we move forward, either as organizations, as a collective, or as we think about other actors that need to change their behavior or actions to be able to be more effective and efficient as a system. And that's what Alejandro is going to talk about. This is just showing you as we think about the work as a collective impact group, so this notion of mutually reinforcing activities. Everybody is engaged in one of the learning communities. It's broadly representative of some of the different factors that we care about. So we think about it by county. So we want organizations from different counties in each of those groups. And we think about it a little bit about in terms of what they do. Are they an advocacy organization? Are they, what's the data in the CS?
No, I actually don't know what the CS is, but data is reflective of what organizations have capacity to produce the data for.
Right, so one of the things you'll hear from Alejandro is when we did our first data pull from people, not everybody's tracking all of the indicators that we care about, right? So part of the question is which indicators are you tracking and then how are you tracking them? So we largely tried to make sure that in each of the areas we had organizations who had had kind of a more robust data around things like stable families or successful students or connected communities. Cassie?
Yes.
Oh, that's right, thanks. We also asked them in the application process to tell us whether they were a culturally specific organization, and if they said they were, we had a set of criteria that our community broadly is defined, and you're used to define culturally specific organizations to say, show us that you're culturally specific, or whether they were not. And if they weren't, we asked them to tell us, largely using the same framework, how were they culturally responsive? So what's their capacity to serve different kinds of organizations, and particularly to serve communities of color? So across the board, we feel like this is a pretty culturally responsive group that we're learning from, but we wanted to make sure that there were culturally specific organizations in each one of those cohorts as well, because that question for us becomes really important in terms of how do we address the needs of specific communities of color. Yeah.
Do you have a learning historian or an external evaluator?
It's so two different questions to some degree. Because I'd say one of the things that I wish we had was in essence kind of a historical anthropologist who could stand alongside us and codify the work we're doing. Because I think there's a lot of work that's there, and our heads are for the most part in the engine, and we're not necessarily seeing the progress we're making there. So as I look at it from this vantage point, I wish that we would have carved out a little bit of resource to be able to do that more effectively than we have. That said, we have been working with an outside evaluator from Portland State University who has a strong and robust history of working in culture specific and culture responsive communities, and helped us to build the framework. It's really similarly been a co-creative process around how we think about the data that we're collecting and the work that we're doing with these organizations, and how that fits into kind of an environment around breaking the cycle of childhood poverty, which is cognizant of kind of policy level impacts, organizational impacts, and then other barriers in the system. So yeah, we do, and we're excited about that piece. I'm glad we carved out a little bit of resource to accomplish that. But I will say two things that it's sitting in the middle of it right now that stick out for me. One is that idea of we didn't put enough energy or resource into thinking about how do you codify the process? How do we make sure we're really being intentional about the story we can tell about what's happening? And the second thing is we don't actually at this point have any resource to support what comes out of some of these conversations, right? So we're giving them general operating support as organizations. They're committed to this idea of building, a policy and advocacy agenda and to learning more effectively about what they could be doing. But we also know there are probably going to be some nuggets that come out of those. That might look like a best practice intervention, which could be scaled up in other places. It might look like a place where we've got some gaps in our region and need some more capacity, right? If I could wave a magic wand, I'd add about $500,000 on top of this to say we want some resource to be able to support innovation that's coming out of these learning communities, and we don't have that right now. So the magic wand I have is key, and trying to talk to some of our other local funders about whether we can start to build some of that capacity in. I'm going to shift. I'm going to say one, it's 11:18, and I'm going to. I've been ineffective at not talking at you for too long. I'm going to blame you because you were asking questions. But I'm going to shift and let Alejandro talk about this question of data. So there's a lot in those other pieces of collective impact that's left outstanding. And a lot of these questions in terms of how do we engage other folks in the process, how do we keep our board there. Like I said, this was clearly not for donors because we would have lost you all about 55 minutes ago. But that question of how do you communicate this to donors is right in the middle of what we're doing right now. And one of the things that donors, you all know, are really interested in is this question of, yeah, but what are you actually doing with my $100 and what's the outcome that's changing? So tell me about what you're doing. We had a board member at the last board meeting say, why can't we just focus on high school graduation? And why can't I just say that we're going to increase high school graduation rates by 20 points? I can sell that. I don't know how to sell this. Right question from the board member, and we're working towards it. But Alejandro is going to share a little bit about the complexity of doing this through a collective impact process, but also the opportunity that we see in doing that.
Yeah.
Ready? One quick question.
Yeah.
Do you have any government agencies as part of your funders?
So interesting question. As a part of aligned with our community transformation work, so I didn't talk about that, but that's the collaborative that we're a part of and invested in. The Multnomah County, all those agencies operate primarily in Multnomah County. Multnomah County decided to invest $1 million in direct service to support culturally specific organizations with communities of color through us in relation to that grant. So they saw an opportunity to leverage the money we were putting in. We saw that as well, and we helped shape their understanding of that. But that there was an ability to say public-private dollars, let's put them together. They were attracted to the idea that most of our resources going into kind of the backbone infrastructure, we've got a pretty good amount of resource there for rigorous evaluation. So their money could go directly into direct service. And they also were attracted with the idea that we said, we're not going to take any admin off the top. We're going to put all these dollars straight into the organizations that are doing the work. So we're in the next 4 months going to help them see that it makes sense for them to continue to make that investment over time. But it was $1 million, so that was our first big government resource there. And then secondly, the early learning hub convening work we're doing, all of that resource is state and federal resources that have been allocated to us to augment work in the community and to do the convening work that we're doing. And that's been new for us too. And part of what's I think important for that there for us as an organization, we didn't have any institutional history, and we've got people who've been here for a long time, of accessing government resources in that direct way before. So this is the first time we've been contracting local and state government dollars through our organization to support our work. And it's an interesting kind of mix then with how you do that in relation to the typical resource, workplace resources that we think about. Alejandro, you're up.
All right, so I have the good fortune of going to both Keith and Zeke, and to talk about data. So, I know, just contain your excitement right before lunch too, so just couldn't get any better than that. Actually, we're not gonna talk a lot about numbers, you're not gonna see a lot of graphics here. What we're gonna talk about really is, how are we doing this work, give you a little bit of a deeper insight into how are we doing this work and what we've learned so far. There's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunities. What you're looking at here is basically the structure for our evaluation framework. We're calling it a learning framework because, as you will see, and as Zeke has talked about, one of the key issues for us is how do we use the data to learn about what works, and how do we then replicate what works in other contexts. The learning framework is basically structured in a way that would allow us to get a better insight into organizations, how they're structured, and how those structures actually lead to better outcomes, or whatever the outcomes may be. So we have, some traditional elements, including financials, how the money is spent, some stories, some annual reporting, demographics of the service population. But then we've tried to really cover a whole range of areas for organizations to try to understand better. We of course have progress indicators that cover each of the strategies that Zeke talked about: successful kids, stable families, connected communities. We're still refining what those are, because as you will see as I continue this conversation, you'll see that many of the challenges have to deal with the systems that organizations have and how they report and collect data. And we're also looking at how do we measure systemic change. And much of this is also organized around the upstream involvement. How are we going to, how are these structures allow us to better understand what are the policy arenas where we could and should have some degree of influence in order to eventually break the cycle of childhood poverty. So the other areas are racial equity, upstream involvement, and continuous quality improvement and knowledge building. And within that, we have racial equity in terms of service provision and organizational operations. How are organizations thinking about implementing practices that lead to a reduction in disparities, for example, around specific outcomes? How do you effectively translate an idea and put it in practice in your services? Upstream involvement, of course, includes what is the capacity to advocate of the organization? How are those organizations identifying the policy barriers? And then how do we begin to shift the discourse away from the notion that this is an issue, poverty is an issue about individuals and individual choices, but really start thinking about it in the context of systems and systems change. And as Zeke mentioned, the quality improvement and knowledge building is a key component of this initiative. And so we want to understand what are the current structures that organizations have that allow them to have a continuous quality improvement process and allow them to use their data to build knowledge, including around all, we have structural enhancements, participation in learning communities, and really thinking about the collective impact, the implementation of that collective impact effort, both from an organizational perspective and as a collective.
Excuse me, what does
Yeah.
structural enhancements mean?
Structural enhancements refers to, and I wish I had my cheat sheet because there's a lot of information here, but it really refers to what are the structures in place that the organization has to have the processes necessary to improve quality. And that may be, having reviews from the board. I mean, I'm happy to share the details of what the learning framework are, because these are condensed into these sentences. There's a lot of questions in there, so we can share perhaps some examples of what the reports look
But
like.
Alejandro, it might look like, do you have staff that are specifically dedicated to thinking about system improvement in your organization? What kind of data systems are you using? Do you just have data systems that are defined by your funders' needs, or have you started to build the capacity to have a data system to tell you where you want to make program improvements? And then what kind of relationship do you have between line staff and governance all the way up to the board to make those kind of program improvements in terms of what you're learning?
But they're feeding you the raw data, and then you're turning it over to your evaluator to.
Yeah, they're feeding us the raw data. Our team is really building evaluative capacity to be able to analyze that information. We've started to share it back with them. You won't see this here, but it's pretty interesting, in a way that says, well, here's what your response was. Kind of here's where you said you were. And a lot of it is a Likert scale. So so there's an opportunity for us to think over time, to look over time and see how have things changed for your organization as you've been involved in this effort. But here's where you are currently, and here's how that relates to the collaborative as a whole. And where we have other data in some places around what's happening, so particularly as we think about those kind of system level progress indicators, how does what you're doing with a particular population relate to what's happening with that population more broadly in the community? So to some degree it's about comparability, and to some degree it's about where do we see consistently across organizations a common theme, either positive or negative, and where do we kind of create the space for them to give us some feedback on what we're learning.
So what we did was we actually asked organizations to submit baseline data, and then we actually had meetings with each of the organizations to better understand what those answers meant. One of the things that we're also learning is that we have to refine this learning framework a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of information that we're seeking, and there were different understandings, different interpretations of our Likert scale and what we meant, for example, by discourse shift. So we're still in the process of refining this tool so that it's more user-friendly in a way. But what we've learned, and the opportunity that this presented to us, was to have a better understanding of how, and I was particularly interested in the area of the progress indicators, because obviously that's what we're going to present to the community and what's going to show progress. But what we have found is that there are a number of limitations and challenges that organizations face, and therefore in a collective impact context, these challenges really limit so far our ability to tell a collective impact story. Let's go back, let's take a moment and think about why is it that we need measurement, shared measurement in a collective impact system. Obviously, it facilitates continuous learning and improvement, which we've been talking about. We have common objective measures of progress. We can ask, are we moving in the right direction? And of course, there's potential for lower costs and greater efficiency in data collection. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, as well as improved credibility and consistency in reporting. Now, there's a continuum of what we mean by shared measurement systems. We can talk about shared data platforms, which is alignment of data collections and storage systems. Does everybody have efforts to outcomes, or are various systems able to talk to each other in a way? Are the data relational? You can have comparative performance systems in which there's greater alignment and measurement because you're using same definitions and methodologies, and then you're able to compare performance with greater ease. But ultimately, what we really want is an adaptive learning system. In other words, a system that engages a large number of organizations working on different aspects of a single complex issue in an ongoing, facilitated process that establishes comparative performance metrics, coordinates our efforts, and enables them to learn from each other. That is the model that we're striving for. That has a lot of requirements within it, and two key aspects of it are, large number of organizations, check, single complex issue. Poverty is a single complex issue. And how do we create that then in a facilitated process that allows us to learn from each other? Poverty is complex. And one of the things that we have to grapple with is the fact of the matter that income is not a very good measure of poverty. Income is just a stake in the sand, but it really doesn't mean much beyond that. And in fact, the poverty measured today is really, abject, are you in abject poverty as opposed to, barely being able to make ends meet. So we have some issues in terms of how we think about poverty and how we think about measuring poverty. The fact of the matter is that poverty is the result of dynamic interactions across multiple systems, whether it's from early childhood, education, the housing system, financial systems, workforce development, etc. I mean, this is just listing a few. And on top of that, you have multiple social and economic factors that affect the outcomes, whether it's the level and type of industrialization in an area, the crime and sense of safety, the racial and ethnic composition. And all of this we know from research that has been done over the last number of decades in terms of the relationships and the interactions of each of these systems. So really, when we're thinking about breaking the cycle of childhood poverty, the strategies need to be beyond income and really thinking about how are the systems related and working towards that ultimate outcome of breaking the cycle of childhood poverty. Our community strengthening cohort, as you have seen, as you can see from the materials that Zeke has passed around, really reflects the complexity of the issue. We have organizations that are touching each of these areas that we believe affect the outcomes in terms of poverty. How does then the United Way of the Columbia-Willamette measure progress of the cohort in a dynamic, complex system? So where do we put our energy, efforts, investments in a way that gives us the greatest likelihood of success? How do we know what is the right combination of strategies around each of these multiple systems that increases the likelihood of having success? For that, we need some basic infrastructure. We do need shared data platforms and metrics. I think we're making progress towards defining what those metrics are, but we're finding a lot of challenges around shared data platforms, and I'm gonna get there in a second. The reason we need this basic infrastructure is ultimately, in answer to the question, is to develop and apply analytic techniques that help us in understanding what are the poverty-generating factors and processes in each of the various communities that we serve. The communities that we serve are diverse, and they're diverse not only in terms of racial and ethnic composition, but on all the other factors that I was mentioning. And systems work differently in different communities for a variety of reasons. In some cases, if a community is very diverse racially and ethnically, the services provided may not be the most amenable, may not be the most responsive to those cultures, and so the effect is different. So we need to have a better understanding of what are those factors that affect poverty-related outcomes. And then we also need to better do scenario planning, to better understand what does the future potentially look like. If we have this combination of factors, this combination of investments, this combination of organizations working together towards a common goal, what could that outcome look like potentially if and taking into account all those other social and economic factors. So what we're talking about is actually using some data science and advanced computing techniques to better understand this. This is an area that the for-profit sector has been using for a long time. We want to understand, is there a role for those techniques to play in the nonprofit social justice sector? You had a question.
How will your data from your learning communities and the collective impact tie up to larger external data that exists in community anyway?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, how will we tie the data from agency level to larger regional population level data? That is one of the questions we got to figure out. I mean, right now it really is and there's a number of techniques that we can do, but I think the focus right now is, first of all, we need to better understand how these agencies and why are these agencies successful. And at this point, it might be a two-stage sort of story, where we're telling a regional story, and then with the agency level data, we're really telling a more sort of, what's the word, not regional, but more localized story. Because what we're finding is that we have sort of clusters of agencies that are able to provide data for the same metrics, and that we may cluster them to tell a story about the work they're doing, as opposed to telling the story of the entire cohort. And that's because we have these challenges that we have found through this research that we've been doing over the last 18 months. In terms, yeah.
So we have 6 more minutes, and then we're done. So
that's because I gave you an extension.
I gave you with an extension. Stop
interrupting me. slides.
I did want to say on that previous slide, one of the choices we could have made at the beginning of this process was actually to lead with a shared data platform and set of metrics, right? So we could have said, if you're going to play this game with us, you need to use this data system, and you need to collect these data points in this way. And we probably could have gotten folks to play with us to some degree. But we believe that if we would have gone about it that way, and part of this comes from our own work in nonprofits, nonprofits would have done what they do otherwise, which is say, okay, I'm going to figure out what that funder wants, and I'm going to play their game the way that they want me to play it, but I'm going to keep doing what I need to do over here because this is my work, right?
That's right.
And so I've got 9 different funders, 25 different funders, all telling me they want this little piece, and I'll play your game, and I'll come, smile for you when you need me to, but I'm going to keep doing the work I want to do here. We wanted to shift it a bit and say, what we're more interested in is there a set of shared data platforms and metrics? And what do they look like that could meet the needs of the organizations themselves? Where they're actually invested in saying, in order to do my work effectively, I need a shared platform with those other organizations. And it needs to be able to connect to what's happening at a higher level in our region as well. It's a premise and an assumption that may be our downfall, but I think it's key to what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think it is key because it allows us to really have a much better understanding of what are the root causes, what is really preventing these organizations to have that level of analytic complexity, if you will. And what we're finding is that there are a vast array of data systems, a vast array of not only indicators, but as Seek mentioned earlier, different ways of telling what those indicators are, different ways of measuring and collecting data for those particular indicators. And this really stems, I believe, based on the information that we've gathered from organizations, first of all, from pressures from funders. Funders, whether they're private funders, foundations, state or federal funders, have a variety of requirements just around data systems. And that has created really a hodgepodge of software that can't talk to each other. And so organizations actually have a challenge telling the story of their organization and why the organization is successful. In fact, funders have a problem in telling that story because as we know, when we're asked, are you being successful, are you meeting your mission, most of us point to a program that either we funded or that organizations are implementing. But that is not the whole story because the effect of these various programs upon a family or an individual or a child really are cumulative or perhaps interact in different ways, but all have a combined effect on the outcomes that we're seeing. And it's not just the effect of that particular program. So we have a challenge in that front. As I said, there's a variety of requirements. There's also an undefined and unclear purpose of using the data. I think one of the most common questions we get is, why are we collecting this for? Why are we reporting this data to you? We have to have we have to be able to reach some level of consensus about why we're using the data that we want to use. There's also a sense of data ownership and competition. You want to present yourself to funders as the best in the field and give us the money because we know what we're doing. And in order to have a true learning environment, we have to break down some of that. There's also that, contributing perhaps to that is this notion of pay to play. Why are we giving you data from this, or from all these programs if you're not funding this program? And we actually have gotten that a lot and have had to overcome that challenge because we're funding capacity building for organizations. We're not funding individual programs. So how do we move from, where are our opportunities and how do we take action? I think we need to build some foundation and elements, and this is where we're moving into. I think we have a much better understanding, a common understanding of what we mean by impact, and what data and analysis really tell a story about that collective impact that we're trying to create. A collective agreement on the use of data. What are the stories that we're going to tell, and what are the strategic investments and decisions that need to go into it? And finally, of course, a shared platform, which ultimately will allow us to align our data better. Ultimately, we do want to develop and implement some practical tools, and by that I mean tools that organizations can use to better understand, the multiple dimensions of poverty, and use the scenario planning and forecasting using client-level data to make better programmatic and investment decisions. Ultimately, we'll want to reach that adaptive learning systems, shared systems, an ongoing participatory process that enables participants to collectively measure, learn, coordinate, and improve performance. Highly aspirational, years away, but these are the steps that we need to take to get there. So that's it, and a minute to spare.
So a couple things before I give you back to Jim. One, I just want to acknowledge a lot of questions here that didn't get answered. I hope that I set enough of a frame up front about the fact that that wouldn't fully happen. Alejandro and Cassie, who are really the people who are largely responsible for that learning framework. We did have outside and do have outside assistants, but they're the ones who've really driven that process. We'll be here for the rest of the day. So if you want to talk to them, they're great people to talk to. A lot of this is built into a set of guides that we've had to put together, or that they've put together to support the organizations as they're doing their work. We're happy to share some of that. So if it's helpful, like the learning framework, Alejandro referred to the fact that there's kind of definition underneath each of those different pieces. We actually can share with you what that framework looks like. That we can share with you, for those of you that were interested in kind of how do we go about the grant making on the front end, what our grant making process looked like. We've got a set of frameworks there. So happy to share any of that information. We believe pretty strongly in being transparently, not only in our own community, but with our peers. And then the other thing I was going to say is if you have questions about now how do you tell this story to donors, Keith is going to remain with us for a certain period of time, and he would love to answer that question. And as he does, record it so that we can actually write it down. Thanks.
Give it up for United Way of It gets worse and uglier before it gets better. That's the, you're in the middle of that. It's a lot of work, and everybody's in a different place in that in their own local community. So one of the things we hope to do at lunch was have some facilitated technical assistance, and that was when I was thinking there would be 30 people in the room and we'd have a lot of time and space. So I'm going to not attempt to do a facilitated lunchtime.